Before we go much further, we need to distinguish between a purely formal theory of a piece of inductive or deductive reasoning and a theory that isn't purely formal. Now, it might be that you just don't want to bother yourself with this right now, in which case it's absolutely fine, of course, to go ahead and come back later if this seems necessary to you then. I would encourage you to do that if you need to. So what is a purely formal theory? Well, let me offer you a series of ideas that will build up to that. The first idea is that arguments have forms. I can illustrate with an argument that you've already seen. All chocolates are good. This is chocolate, therefore this is good. So this is a logically valid argument. There's no possible situation where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. But here's the curious thing. It's not really an argument whose logical validity depends on chocolate, right? It would work just as well if you replaced chocolates with dogs or some other kind of interesting, tasty snack. Likewise, it's not really an argument about the good. It would work just as well if you replaced the good with the bad. You'd still get a logically valid argument. So in a sense, this is an argument which has a form, and we can imagine that other arguments would have the same form. Now here's the second idea. There is such a thing as deductive or logical validity. So I'm calling it deductive validity here, but I've also used the term logical validity. I was tempted, I'm using both, which is very bad, naughty Steve. I'm using both because it's actually the thing that makes a deductive argument good or bad. If you're offering what's supposed to be a deductive argument, then the standard for that argument to be a good one is the standard given to you by deductive validity. An argument's deductively valid just if there's no possible situation in which its premises are true and its conclusion false. I've said that a couple of times already in this lecture, but I wanted you to have it written out as well. So this is a very important notion, and in fact when you study logic, the formal logic course next term, if you are studying that, you'll discover that this is actually the topic of the formal logic course. There we go, okay, good. Why is that interesting? Well, the thought is this: it's not just that this argument is deductively valid, it's that any argument with the same kind of form, swap out the chocolate with the dog, swap out the good with the incredible, and you've still got a logically valid argument. All arguments of this form are logically valid. Now, if we want to, we can celebrate that fact by introducing some letters which stand in for these gaps. Sorry, this is just to remind you that it's deductively valid. What we could say, instead of using the lovely pink and blue colours that I'm so fond of, we could say all F's are G, this is an F, therefore this is a G. Now, sometimes people are confused about these F's and G's, but you shouldn't be confused about them, because what they're doing are just marking holes. You see, just like there's a pink hole and a blue hole, and the rule is that you can put anything you like in the pink hole, as long as A, it's a predicate, like chocolate or dogs or something like that, picks out a kind of thing, and B, you put the same thing in both pink holes. That's exactly what the F's are doing. Put any predicate you like in there, as long as you put the same predicate in all of the F holes. Same thing for the G. They're just ways of marking holes. I've used colour before and now I'm using letters. It's the same thing. Doesn't make any difference. Okay, very good. So now I've snuck in a third idea. And the third idea is that we can think about deductive validity as applying not just to particular arguments, but also forms that arguments take. We can think of deductive validity as applying to not just particular arguments, but also to forms that arguments take. Some argument forms guarantee deductive validity in this sense. Any argument of that form will be deductively valid. It's not about the chocolate, it's not about the good. The same form of argument will work again and again. So here, we're right now able to answer the question, what is it for a theory of a kind of reasoning, deductive reasoning, abductive or inductive reasoning, to be a purely formal theory? The answer is simple. It must be a theory according to which the form of argument is what determines whether it is valid. If you've got a purely formal theory, you've got a theory that says whether or not the argument is valid, deductively, inductively or abductively, is just a matter of the form that the argument has and nothing else. That's a purely formal theory. Now, purely formal theories, of course, are super attractive to us because they provide us with, if you like, the simplest, most direct answer to our question about what makes an argument a good or a bad piece of reasoning. We can say, well, it just takes the right form. It's just a matter of the form that the argument takes. And you can sort of see that this is going to have some legs in the case of deductive arguments. So, for example, all chocolates are good, this is good, therefore this is chocolate. That of course is a terrible argument because chocolate is not the only good thing, right? Dogs are also good, for example, crisps are also good. So the fact that this is good doesn't tell you that it's chocolate, it could be a dog. It's a bad mistake to make, I suppose. Whereas, as I mentioned before, this is a perfectly good argument. This over here, all chocolates are good, this is chocolate, therefore this is good. You will not go wrong. You will not go wrong. Now, of course, you might reject the premise. You might say the argument, Steve, is not sound. It has a false premise. You might not agree with me that all chocolates are good. I'm prepared to accept that you might, but nevertheless, the argument's logically valid. There's no situation where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. You won't go wrong with the argument, even though it may have false premises. And what we can see, of course, is that these arguments are of strikingly different form. Look at the pattern. You see how the pattern goes? We've got different patterns, and you can see that by looking at the splodges. If you can make out different colours of splodge there, you can see that the two forms are different. One of those forms is such that any instance of it will be a valid argument. The other is such that no instance of it will be, almost no instance of it will be a valid argument. I shouldn't say no instance because you can do some clever stuff depending on exactly what you put in there to get me valid arguments. But that's a topic for another day. I shouldn't get carried away there. Very good. So when it comes to deduction, we can have good forms and we can have bad forms. And as you'll see, if you take that formal logic course, there's an awful lot to say about good forms and bad forms. An awful lot to say. It turns out to be quite an interesting enterprise, characterising argument forms when you're interested in deductive validity. But let's be careful here. Can we show that all deductive arguments are valid in virtue of their form? Is that what I'm trying to tell you? No, that is not what I'm trying to tell you at all. Because this indeed, I think, is false. I do not believe that you can characterise all deductive arguments by specifying their forms. I do not think that there is a purely formal theory of deductive reasoning. But that really isn't our concern. That's a concern that you might have if you take a lot of logic courses and you go as far as the course called Logic 3, where you look at some of the Gödel incompleteness theorems and perhaps Tarski's proof about the undefinability of truth. I don't suggest that there's any very clear piece of reasoning that I'm offering you here. I just think we ought to be very cautious here. I have not suggested, nor do I believe, and nor do I think you should believe, that we can characterise all deductive arguments in virtue of a particular kind of form that they have. I don't think we can have a purely formal theory of deductive reasoning. What about the inductive arguments, though? Can we show that all inductive arguments are valid in virtue of their forms? Well, this will be for us quite an interesting question in what follows, but you can already see that we're going to find some difficulty here. If you reflect on the good argument I showed you, here's a good inductive argument. I've never seen an Aisha stop for a red light, therefore Aisha will not stop for this red light. And a bad inductive argument, here's a bad one. I've run numerous traffic lights without accident, therefore I can run these traffic lights without accident. In order to show that inductive arguments are valid in virtue of their form, we'd have to say that these two things differ in some interesting way in their purely formal properties, the shape of the arguments, and it's that that makes one good and the other bad. But what you might already suspect if you look at these two arguments, the better one and the worse one, you might think it isn't obvious that you're going to get goodness and badness out of the form of these arguments. So on the face of it, it looks like the answer here should be no. Although there are several very famous and brilliant philosophers who spent much of the 20th century trying to show that we could do this, that we could identify particular forms that would give us the key to inductive or abductive validity. So there's the challenge. And this relates directly to our question, What's the relation between the premises of an abductive or inductive argument and its conclusion? The simplest and most direct thing to do would be to offer a formal theory, a purely formal theory, that specifies the relation just in terms of formal properties of the premises and the conclusions. We've seen that you can do something of that for some deductive arguments, for subclasses of deductive arguments, and indeed that's turned out to be quite a useful activity. How are things in the case of inductive and abductive arguments? That's what we're going to find out. Is it possible to give a formal characterization of those arguments? At this stage, that should be an open question. I've given you a hint that we're going to encounter some difficulties, but the main thing for now is just that we understand what the notion of a purely formal theory of an inductive or abductive piece of reasoning is.